We don't understand that every lake or a pond is a habitat in itself, which houses frogs, snakes, crabs, turtles, birds, so many different life forms. Human beings directly depend on underground water source. So a lake or a pond is necessary to replenish these groundwater resources.
You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, an achievable goal or just hot air? We examine Boris Johnson's pledge to turn all UK electricity green by 2035. Stop breaking your promises. Nearly 2 million Fairtrade workers call on world leaders to compensate low-income nations affected by climate change. And show me the green way to go home. As Google Maps starts offering eco-friendly routes, we'll ask how much big tech can help individuals do their bit. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, it was a promise made during the Conservative Party conference, but ultimately, and perhaps unexpectedly, it didn't feature in Boris Johnson's concluding keynote speech. This week, the Prime Minister promised that all UK electricity would come from renewable and nuclear sources by 2035, a date that's just 14 years away. Anyone expecting more flesh on the bones from Mr Johnson today might have been disappointed. But don't worry, our science editor Tom Clark has been looking at just how attainable that pledge is.
If the government is serious about its net zero ambitions, we're going to need some details, say analysts, including this former government advisor. And given the timescales, we'll have to see them soon.
In order to believe this, is likely to have a huge ramp up in renewables, in wind power, offshore and onshore wind and solar. You're going to have a huge ramp up in nuclear. This is a massive challenge. Innovators, the kind we work with at the catapult and industry, are up for it, but they're going to need clear direction from government.
His organisation's latest report, seen exclusively by Sky News, finds under any scenario, the 10 gigawatts of offshore wind power we currently have needs to increase at least 5 times and probably a lot more to meet net zero. And we'll probably need 3 times more nuclear power than we have right now, up to 26 gigawatts. But it also finds we'll need huge amounts of zero carbon hydrogen, of which we currently have none. But it's closer than you might think. In this lab at ITM Power in Sheffield, water and electricity is going into an electrolyser. Hydrogen and oxygen is bubbling out. It's the R&D behind the largest electrolyser factory in the world. Its aim, to make enough hydrogen to replace increasingly pricey natural gas.
Everyone's committed to green energy. I think what we're really trying to discuss is how we accelerate that commitment and actually make it a closer reality, as opposed to it being further afield. And I think the commitment is which green energy supplies electrolysis and hydrogen. Not that it's one or the other in terms of fossil fuels. It must be green renewable energy.
To drive the point home, just down the road is a forecourt where wind energy is converted to hydrogen on site, used to fill hydrogen-powered cars. In theory, hydrogen is the perfect complement to an electricity grid dominated by lots of wind power, because on those really windy days when you've got an excess of electricity, you can make lots of hydrogen, which you can then store to fuel cars, power industry, or make more electricity on those calm days when you haven't got any wind power. The challenge is turning that theory into practice. A major commitment to renewables will ensure a future for hydrogen, but clear policies need to be in place to deliver a low-carbon electricity grid, and we don't have them yet. Tom Clark, Sky News, Sheffield.
So back to Boris Johnson's conference speech now, and it may have been short on detail as far as climate plans are concerned, but there was a nod to the difficult job ahead at COP26, which is now less than a month away.
In just a few weeks, this country will host the summit of our generation in Glasgow, when the resolve of the world is put to the test. Can we keep alive the ambition of Paris to stop the planet heating by more than 1.5 degrees? Well, government can't do it alone, and taxpayers certainly can't do it alone.
Well, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is at Westminster for us. So, John, was it a surprise that the Prime Minister chose not to mention, let alone flesh out, his brand new green commitment in his keynote speech?
Well, there wasn't much detail on any of his policies. He did refer to it. I mean, in the run-up to that little passage we heard about COP, the Prime Minister said, we face a challenge even more existential to our way of life. And then he talked about COP. Now, it was Monday when he went to visit a national rail site that he made that pledge about 2035 and green electricity. On that, he said today, he talked about sorting out our energy supply, more wind, more nuclear, becoming less dependent on hydrocarbons from abroad, which is the same message, just less detail. There were quite a few green references in the speech. He talked about 4,000 more clean green buses made in this country, some of them running on hydrogen. He talked about we're going to rewild, he said, parts of the country and consecrate a total of 30% to nature, planting millions of trees. And he did talk in quite poetic language about those wind farms. He talks about going out into the Murray Firth to see an aquatic forest of white turbines towering over the water like the redwoods of California. And he spoke about how important they were doing something to save the planet and get Britain to net zero by 2050.
John, thank you. Now, nearly 2 million Fairtrade farmers and producers have written an open letter to world leaders due to attend next month's COP26 summit, asking them to keep their promises to low-income countries disproportionately affected by climate change. Well, the letter outlines 4 key demands, and the first is for $100 billion of climate finance to be delivered. Now, that's been pledged by the richer nations to help vulnerable countries mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. Next, it asks world leaders to include policies which will reduce emissions from imported goods. There's also a call for low-carbon trade deals to help farmers and businesses that invest in sustainability. And finally, it tells leaders to strengthen business regulations so that companies take ownership of the environmental issues in the supply chains. Well, I spoke earlier to Kate MacArthur, who's Fairtrade Africa's commercial director, and began by asking just why she felt the letter was necessary.
The letter is so important because it's just reminding the world leaders of the promises they made in terms of reducing emissions, on climate finance, and ensuring that the business climate is governed by environmental friendly policies. So that those are just really reminding them to deliver on their promise, because then the producers here in Africa are doing their best to mitigate and adapt to the climate changes. What Fairtrade farmers are currently doing, they're planting trees in their cocoa and coffee plantations to ensure that the crops are shaded and that the yields can somewhat remain as they were before, and also protecting the soils. They've adapted to using solar solutions for their lighting, for their cooking, and also even adapted technology in terms of Fairtrade delivering standards and training materials to them.
Well, yes, and we've heard in recent weeks that President Biden is pledging to double the US's climate finance to $11.4 billion. Does that give you encouragement that world leaders are stepping up?
It's really a mixed feeling, because the previous promises, only about less than 2% actually got to the smallholder producers. So we can always have hope, but we need to have a great mechanism to ensure that the pledges are delivered and delivered to the smallholder farmers. So I'm glad that the issue is coming up. I'm glad that they're promising more, but they actually need to act and ensure that that money comes to the producers so that they can address the climate changes. After all, most of the smallholder producers are the least emitters, and there's too much burden on them. So it's good to get the world leaders to commit and deliver onto their promise.
Ultimately, businesses are trying to make profits, aren't they? And margins can be pretty tight, especially in this country, for example, with energy prices going up. Do consumers have to accept they may have to pay higher prices for climate-aware products?
Currently, we find some of our producers, some of our consumers, they're already paying that price. And that is what is helping the Fairtrade farmers and smallholder workers really thrive. But again, what we are saying is it doesn't have to be at an extreme premium. We're saying as the sustainable production, sustainable consumption wave catches on, there could be additional costs that everyone within the supply chain will cover. But the more we do it from the consumers, from the business partners, from the governments, then over time with economies of scale, then you find that the premium doesn't have to be that high for the consumers to pay. And what we are noticing now is the consumers who are buying sustainably produced products, could be Fairtrade, it could be any other, it's going a long way in ensuring that the farmers are getting a fair wage that goes to meet their basic needs like food, education, really basic needs that any consumer, any producer needs to be met.
In today's other climate news now, a climate protester interrupted a catwalk at Louis Vuitton's Paris Fashion Week with a banner condemning the effects of fashion on the environment. The woman, representing Friends of the Earth in France, Extinction Rebellion and Youth for Climate, was then wrestled to the ground and hustled away by security guards. Workers on the Greek island of Evia are building wooden flood barriers to protect coastal villages there. That's because devastating wildfires destroyed the plants and trees which would normally absorb rainfall. Around 300,000 acres of forest and bushland were burnt across Greece this summer amid the country's worst heatwave in 30 years. And Google has revealed that it'll be launching new sustainability features. The search engine will allow users to view emission estimates when searching for hotels or flights. And Google Maps will start including greener routes. Investors will also be able to receive portfolio scores on Google Finance in order to calculate how eco-friendly their investments are. Well, do stay with us. Coming up after the break, I'll be joined by podcast host Maryam Pasha and climate advisor to the White House, Jerome Foster. And we're going to be discussing what climate leadership should look like. And in the light of that, Google development, whether big high tech can help us go green.
The best innovation comes when there is a need and a problem to solve. Rarely have we faced a more testing time. Join us live from Yorkshire for the first in a series of Sky News in-person events, where we will explore how to fire up UK business. Watch thought-provoking discussions with Sky News experts on building a stronger and greener economy. Think big with us. Big Ideas, live on Sky News.
I witnessed how the Catalan fight for independence split families. It was from this chamber that Carles Puigdemont declared independence in October.
I come here because I want to show other people what happened.
I'm Michelle Clifford and I'm Sky's Europe correspondent. It's not the aim of the smugglers to actually get people to UK shores, but simply into British waters. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. There are real concerns here now about whether the health system will be able to cope. President Macron has spoken in defence of freedom of expression, saying France won't give up its caricatures and drawings made by people who dare to challenge. Afternoon, Mr. Barnier. How are you?
I have no time for any polemics.
Anger at the police, anger at the government, anger about wider social and economic problems in this nation.
We are on the verge of fascism and we have a country to save.
cercando as áreas, limpando as áreas e progressivamente avançando com os plantios. Isso daqui é uma sentença de morte para os manguezais.
Did you know if we tried to use less energy, we could help reduce air pollution? What, like turning off the lights and stuff? Yeah.
Northern and western parts will be largely overcast with outbreaks of rain in the northwest and patchy drizzle and hill fog elsewhere. Eastern Britain, meanwhile, will be mostly dry with sunny spells. It's going to be warmer than it has been recently, but it will be windy for many. The afternoon will bring little change, with northern and western parts staying dull and damp into the evening. The southwesterly wind will bring clean air from the Atlantic, so the air pollution index, where 1 means low pollution and 10 means very high, will be low everywhere.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with host of the Climate Curious podcast, Maryam Pasha, and White House climate advisor, Jerome Foster. So good evening to both of you. Good to see you both. So first of all, Boris Johnson's speech today was, I think it's fair to say, light on policy detail. It was also pretty light on references to climate change. Now, compare that to his speech to the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks ago, which he dedicated entirely to the need for action on climate change. And as the host of the huge COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, coming up in only a few weeks, what does this say about his leadership and how should leaders approach climate action? So, Maryam, to you first of all. So, there was little reference to it in his conference speech, but we did hear from the Prime Minister this week making a new pledge to turn the power grid green by 2035. The latest, some would say, in a line of quite ambitious climate targets. So is that what good climate leadership looks like?
I do think that the time for pledges and commitments is kind of coming to an end. I think people will need action. I think we need to know how we're going to get there and what it's going to mean for every single person that lives in this country. And I think pledges are a great place to start, but it seems that if we end there, we're never going to be able to take the steps we need to take to address this climate crisis.
Would you agree with that, Jerome, that targets are all very well, but you have to spell out to the public, to businesses, perhaps to fellow politicians that you need to get on side as well, what it means to reach those targets? And do you think that, as an advisor to Joe Biden, do you think he's doing any better on that front?
Absolutely. I think that when we talk about the differences between the UK and the US right now, the US has a whole of government approach. And we talk about it from an electric vehicle standpoint, from a job standpoint, and from an overall solution standpoint. And we have the details. And I think that's what was really encouraging about the US, is that we are working towards that and we are seeing tangible results. But
Joe Biden has a fight on his hand to convince everybody in government, hasn't he, to come on side with some of the plans. It's not all straightforward there. Jerome?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, we're seeing a $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill, which, if passed, would accomplish many of this administration's goals. And that's really a challenge right now. Over the next week or so, we're working to convince other elected officials that this is an urgent priority and has to be tackled with the details at the forefront.
Well, yes, and finance is really important, isn't it, Maryam? Not just in convincing fellow politicians. There are different departments within government that are all vying for money in a post-COVID era, but also you've got to convince the public as well, who might worry that it's going to cost them more, these plans to go green. That takes leadership, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's also about really showing all of us here in the UK that actually by reaching our green targets, by making those pledges and actually attaining them, that we're actually going to be able to live up to some of the targets that people want in their own lives when it comes to jobs and health. Like the environmental targets we set also let us achieve other things that people do already care about. So it's not just about diverting everything to the environment, but looking at how all these things intersect.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned jobs, actually, because, Jerome, I'm just going to point out what Joe Biden has said about jobs and the green economy. He said it's going to create millions of jobs. I think it's a gigantic opportunity to create really good jobs. And clearly, Joe Biden's strategy is trying to frame this as a kind of positive economic step. But is that cutting through? People are worried there, aren't they, about jobs in fossil fuel industries going. And the country's really quite divided on the climate question, isn't it?
I think that it actually is very straightforward when we talk about jobs. It's when we talk about workforce development, we transition people who are working in fossil fuels to now install solar panels and wind turbines. It's a jobs perspective at the very forefront. Every solution will create millions of good paying jobs. And the biggest thing that we're working on right now is called the Civilian Climate Court, which would mobilize millions of young Americans to be able to work directly in the solutions that will save us. When we talk about the cost of solutions, we have to talk about also the cost of not implementing them. The cost of natural disasters devastating communities is far higher than the solutions that are needed that also will have a positive job impact as well.
OK, and interesting to see if that does bring people on side. Let's move on to our second subject now, though, shall we? And Google announced today various strategies to help consumers act in a more sustainable and eco-friendly way. Now, this is all quite light touch stuff, but considering how big a role these companies play in our daily lives, what are their responsibilities and can big tech help us go green? So, Maryam, just to illustrate some of what they're doing, Google have said that they're giving a green badge to lower emission flights and eco-friendly hotels. They've also got features like maps defaulting to eco-friendly routes. Is this a good idea? Is it going to help us be nudged towards making more sustainable choices in our lives?
Giving people more information and more data is always going to make it easier for them to make informed choices. I think that transparency is absolutely great. And I think that people will be able to make those choices in an informed way now. But whether that putting this responsibility on the individual entirely is a good idea, I think it's not. I think we need to also understand that this is a whole society that needs to act together. So if this helps people do their part, that's great, but we can't stop here.
We can't. So, how much further should we go? Do you think? Then, I mean, you think saying that these big tech companies should do more?
Well, I think that the big tech companies do have one really big responsibility, which is about addressing misinformation about climate change. That is something that they have in their control and has a massive impact on the way that individuals understand the climate crisis. And we've seen the influence these companies have had in things from elections to vaccines. And so they need to take that responsibility when it comes to information on climate change as well.
And it's interesting, actually, I think, because Google did say today that in a bid to combat misinformation, users who head to Google search with questions about climate change, they'll be shown data from sources like the United Nations as well as trusted news sources on that issue. That's what they've said. Jerome, what's your take on this? What role can these big companies play in helping us change our behaviour?
This is a very encouraging step to see from Google and tech companies in general, but I think that also we have to ensure that we aren't placing the blame, just like Maryam said. Everyday people did not cause the climate crisis. It was the companies and socioeconomic systems that created the climate crisis in the first place. So they must be the first and foremost to basically break the solutions. And that looks like them changing their logistics and their supply chain, not telling everyday people that they should make small incremental choices. It's and both. And I think that's really good, because also I think Google has made some steps, but we need to see much more when it comes to the next decade of mobilizing on a massive scale to avert the worst impacts.
So very briefly, you think they do have a responsibility? They're not just companies who are free to do what they like?
Oh, they have an absolute responsibility to protect people because they create services that pollute the environment. So if they're continuing to do that, they have to say, we're going to switch to make sure we aren't continuing to harm people and communities. It's 100% on them to change. And as a small impact people have.
Sorry to cut you off, Jerome, but we are out of time. Jerome Foster, Maryam Pasha, really good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed. So we're out of time, but do stay tuned with us here on Sky News for Sky News Tonight. Described as a gift to the world, especially Africa, the latest on the first malaria vaccine.